Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, we're going to be talking about de-icing, but not the de-icing that you've seen on other videos. We're going to be talking about how the pilots decide what kind of de-icing is needed, how the different de-icing fluids look, what we do in the cockpit to avoid this from happening. And also, I'll be explaining why some of the airports in the United States were closed last week because of winter ops procedures. So stay tuned.
Wind 31016, everyone right, right on. Clear to land, 31 right.
Delta 260, reduce.
This video is brought to you by my long-term sponsor, Brilliant.org. Now, if you want to improve on your mathematical skills and your physics skills, and you want to do that in a really interactive and fun way, and you know you're going to need to do that in order to start your pilot studies in the first place, well then I highly recommend you that you use this link here below. It will give you 20% off the annual fee of Brilliant, but as always, it's completely free to go and check them out, so click it. Okay, so de-icing. De-icing is a fascinating thing, and de-icing is part of one of the more potentially risky normal operations that a pilot ever faces. So when we talk about de-icing, there's a few things that we need to start with. First of all, we have something called a 5-step procedure. Now, a 5-step procedure was determined to be needed. About 25 years ago, there was an incident of an aircraft flying out of Turin, where the captain decided that in the morning, when they did a walk around, decided that we need to do de-icing. The de-icing was done. The aircraft took off, but it turned out that it wasn't properly de-iced. So part of clear ice that was stuck on the wing broke loose during the rotation. It got sucked into the rear mounted engines. One engine failed and the other one almost failed. Okay, they managed to turn back in, land safely, but during the investigation afterwards, the aviation authorities decided that there's no clear set procedure for who is actually responsible for each step. So we need to establish that. So after that, this 5-step procedure came into force. And when it is winter ops, when I go out to the aircraft in the morning and I realize that it's been snowing during the night, or maybe it's snowing still, or it might be just frost, I will have to decide whether or not de-icing is needed. And that is step 1. Step 1 is the contamination check, and that's done generally by either a pilot who's doing the walk around or an engineer who can do it during the night as well. And that's where we go around and we look at all of the different surfaces to see whether or not there's contaminants on it. Now, the way that the philosophy around flying any type of aircraft is that the wings and all of the control surfaces should be clean. So if we see that there has been ice accumulated during the night or it's snowing, well then we're going to need to de-ice at least the wings, the stabilizer and sometimes the fin, depending on whether or not the snow is actually stuck to the fin. In some circumstances, if it's snowing heavily, we might also have to de-ice the entire body of the aircraft, and this will take quite a lot of time. But anyway, we decide on that, and if we do decide that we need to de-ice, we fill in something called a de-icing request form. Now, these forms look different in different airports and different companies, but they basically outline the same, which is the first 3 steps of the 5-step procedure. So, step 1, contamination check. I will tick what part of the aircraft that needs to be de-iced, and I will also decide whether or not I need a 1-step de-icing or a 2-step de-icing. Okay? A 1-step de-icing is where it might have snowed during the night, but it's not snowing anymore. So I just need all of the contaminants, all of the snow to be cleared for the wings, and stabilizer and fin. If we need to do a 1-step de-icing, we tend to use a type 1 fluid. Type 1 fluid is a very low viscosity fluid, which means it runs like water. It tends to be orange in color. And the only thing that a type 1 fluid really does, it will remove everything. Okay, it doesn't have a long holdover time. I'll get to holdover times in a minute. So if that's needed, they're just going to spray everything. If you're sitting as a passenger and you look out and you see that it's orange, well then that's a type 1 fluid being applied. It tends to be heated up to a certain temperature, around 60-75 degrees somewhere, in order to make sure that everything is gone. Okay. It is not hot water, because hot water would get cold very quickly and then freeze into clear ice. So it still has, normally it's ethylene glycol or propylene glycol that is made out of. Anyway, so that's step 1. Step 2, if we need to do a 2-step de-icing, is that we've done step 1 with type 1 fluid. Okay. Then after we have removed it, we need to apply a little bit thicker fluid. That tends to be either a type 2 or a type 4 fluid. Now these fluids are made out of the same, so normally propylene glycol, but they also have a thickening agent in them. This means that they have a higher viscosity, so they're not just running off the wings, they actually stay on the wings, and they're designed to stay there until the aircraft reaches a specific speed. In the case of type 2 and type 4, it tends to be around 100 knots. At 100 knots, the fluid is supposed to shear off the wing, disappear, and leave the wing completely clean for when we start rotating the aircraft. Right? So the reason that it's done like that is because we need something called a holdover time. Holdover time is the designed time that a fluid is designed to keep the wings clear of contaminant. The holdover time varies in different temperatures and also with different types of precipitation. So if it's just light snow and the temperature is around 0, then a type 2 fluid typically gives about an hour, maybe even an hour and a half of holdover time, so no problem. Now, if the precipitation starts to become moderate snow, well, then that will decrease to maybe 25 minutes, 30 minutes or so. And that's because the contamination is going to be starting to dilute the fluid. And at some point, the fluid loses its capability of keeping the wing clean and will start to be patches of ice. When that happens, the holdover time has expired and the aircraft is no longer protected and needs to be de-iced again. Okay? And this is very, very important. The holdover times tend to have a span, so they give a little bit of a time span, maybe 20 minutes to 40 minutes or something like that. And then it's up to the pilots to decide how bad the precipitation is. Right? If it's very light snow, then maybe it's the longer time range. If it's like closer to moderate, then it's the shorter. Generally speaking, we tend to just use the shorter holdover time just to be on the safe side. Right? Okay. Now, there are certain types of precipitation that doesn't have holdover time. That's what I'm getting to in a second, and the reason why some of the airports had to close in the United States last week. Okay, so type 2, if you're doing a two-step de-icing, then step 1 needs to be done and then immediately followed by step 2. So you can't clear the aircraft first and then apply the second step. Now you do type 1, then type 2, and then you move to the rest of the aircraft. The holdover time will start counting from the first application of the second step fluid. So it doesn't count from when you're cleaning the wing, but when they start putting on the thickened agent, the type 2 or type 4 fluid, then the holdover time starts ticking. So this means that if you have to de-ice the entire aircraft, it's going to take a long time, and all of that time is going to eat into your holdover time. So you might not have enough time to reach the runway then, and that can be a problem, especially when it's snowing heavily. With me so far? Great. So that is the step 2. So step 1 was the contamination check. Step 2 is the de-icing procedure. Step 1 is the responsibility of the captain or the engineer. Step 2 is the responsibility of the de-icing provider. So whoever has been trained to run these trucks, that is cleaning and is applying the liquid, they have done specific training to make sure that they're doing it correctly, that it's equally applied on both wings and the stabilizer and the fin, and also to check for contaminants. So they basically sign off that yes, this procedure has been properly done. Step 3 is that it's the contamination check after the procedure has been applied. So if we think, for example, that there might be clear ice present, that happens typically if we've landed with loads and loads of cold fuel in the wings, and it's raining on top of that. Then it might form clear ice that is almost impossible to see, especially if it's raining on top of it. In that case, we tick the box that they have to do a tactile check. That means that they have to go down and actually physically feel the top of the wing to make sure that all contaminants are properly gone. So that's the third step. Step 4 and step 5 is completely up to the flight crew. And step 4 happens when we reach the departing runway at the holding point just prior to takeoff. Okay? We have to then stop the aircraft. In most cases, when we have freezing conditions, we also do some procedures in the cockpit in order to make sure that we haven't extended the flaps until we reach the holding point, for example, because the flaps are not protected. We are doing the de-icing procedure with the flaps up. So, and that's to protect the mechanisms and not get this thickened fluid into the flap mechanism. So when we reach the holding point, we stop there. And step 4 is us discussing whether or not the holdover time is still valid. Because you might have things like, for example, a change in outside conditions. So we might have calculated the holdover time based on light snow. But during the taxi out, it actually started snowing heavy. And in that case, the previous holdover time that we calculated is no longer valid. So we might be outside of our holdover time. We also have to ask ourselves, what was the holdover time and what is the time now? And if it looks like we have exceeded the holdover time or the conditions have worsened considerably, well then we're not protected anymore and we have to taxi back and do step 5, which is the pre-takeoff contamination check. That's basically step 1 again. So that will start the whole kind of cycle again. All right? So that's the 5 steps that we follow, and we have to follow these really strictly. So it's really important that we do not try to take off with wings contaminated anyway. If the wings are contaminated, the stall speed of the aircraft will go up. It's not sure that we will be able to rotate at the speed that we think we should be able to rotate at. It's very dangerous, okay? And as shown by, for example, the accident that happened in Gottröra outside of Sweden, where an McDonnell Douglas 81 took off and had similar problems like in Turin. The ice was still on the wings, it broke off and went into the engines. That can also happen, okay, especially with rear mounted engines. So we do not take any risks when it comes to that. This is why you might have to return to stand and de-ice again. Very annoying for passengers and for crew, but it's a safety measure that just has to be taken. So what about the cockpit procedures then? Well, the cockpit procedures differ in wind drops. So when we see that it's freezing conditions outside, which means that it is, for example, snowing, that the temperature is below 3 degrees Celsius and we have visible moisture of any sort, well, then we are going to have to use a separate checklist, the wind drops freezing condition checklist. But when it comes specifically to de-icing, before the de-icing procedure is allowed to start, we need to set the aircraft up, okay? So the de-icing provider will ask, are you ready to start the de-icing? Normally they are on a separate radio frequency that we call into. That goes to the person sitting inside of the de-icing truck, and they will verify with us whether or not we're ready. We will then do a checklist. And that checklist makes sure that the flaps are up, like I said before, to protect the mechanism. That we've turned off the APU if it's not needed. Okay, we can have the APU on if there's no ground power available, but generally speaking we try to turn it off. And also that the APU bleed is off and that the stab trim is set. Okay, so we go through this checklist, making sure of all that. And why is it important that the APU bleed is off then? Well, what can happen if you have the APU bleed on? Okay, so the APU, the little jet engine in the back of the aircraft, is now providing all of the air into the cabin. When the de-icing crew goes around the aircraft and they start to de-ice the tail, the APU inlet on the 737 is very close to the tail. So it is likely that the crew will spray a little bit of fluid into the inlet. And when that fluid enters into the inlet, if the APU bleed is on, that will basically turn into disco smoke. It will entirely fill the passenger cabin with white smoke that smells like, well, propylene glycol. Very nasty. It's not dangerous. It's probably not fantastically healthy either, but it's definitely something that we want to avoid. So we make sure that all of that is done. The aircraft is ready. We'll tell them, and they will start the de-icing procedure. Then, once the de-icing procedure is complete, we wait for 1 minute, and that's to make sure that all the fluid that might be close to the inlet is kind of dripped off. then we can start starting the APU, start using the APU Bleed, which we will need to start our engines anyway. So that's if we're de-icing on stand, which is very common, especially in Europe. In some of the more northern countries that are more prone to heavy winter ops procedures, there tend to be a specific de-icing platform. In best case scenario, that de-icing platform is very close to the runway. And in that case, we do a procedure called de-icing with engines running, which is a little bit more complex, but it's very similar. We will then push back. The wings are still full with snow and everything. We will start our engines. We will taxi out to that de-icing platform. And then we will stop, call the de-icing crew of the radio, and we will start following the de-icing with engine running checklist, which is similar. It just turns off the packs and the engine bleeds. And once again, making sure that the flaps are up, and then we can start the procedure. And the benefit of doing that is that if you have a de-icing platform close to the runway, the holdover time will start counting from when the de-icing then is started. And if you just close the runway, once the de-icing procedure is complete, we just complete our checklist and we go. So it's very unlikely that your holdover time will expire. While if you're doing it on the stand, especially if you're in a big airport and it might be slippery taxiways, well then the holdover time is more likely to expire before we reach the holdover point, and we have to go back in and we have to de-ice again. Right? Makes sense? Good. So I was talking about what can stop airport from actually working then. We can actually close an airport down, which happened in the United States last week. That is when you start to have precipitation that doesn't have holdover time. So, for example, freezing rain. Freezing rain, heavy freezing rain, or even heavy snowfall means that there's no de-icing fluid in the world that can guarantee that no icing is starting to build. Because freezing rain will just hit, the droplet will hit the runway surface and also the wing surfaces and the body, and will instantaneously turn into ice. All right. When that happens, we can't operate. All right. If it starts to become heavy freezing rain when the aircraft is already taxied out, they might actually get stuck where they are because it becomes instantaneously so slippery that it's unsafe to move the aircraft before the airport can go out and grit the runways. And even if they can grit the runways or do something about it, the treatment, we still don't have holdover time to allow us to take off. And that's what happened in the United States last week. They had these ice storms, and when these ice storms comes and hit, there's just nothing we can do. We just have to wait for it to stop, because we have to be able to guarantee the safety of our passengers, and that's what we'll do. It might be annoying, there might be a lot of delays for you guys, but it's just the safest course of action. Right? Cool. Well, what about de-icing the engines then? We can't spray de-icing fluid straight into the engines. No, we can't. So during the walk around, when the pilots decide where we need to de-ice, if we find that there is icing on the fan blades, that you normally have to kind of feel in behind the fan blades closest to the spinner, the little round thing with the spiral on. If you feel in there might be ice inside there, because at the tops of the fan blades, the velocity of the engine would have been so high, the velocity of the fan blades, so that all the ice has disappeared. But inside, close to the spinner, you might find it. Well, then there are two ways of getting rid of it. One way is to get one of those cabin heaters out. Cabin heaters are normally in airports where it's really cold during the night, so they connect that to the aircraft to make sure that it doesn't freeze inside and freeze up all of the toilet tubing and things like that. Well, you can use one of those and just spray hot air onto the engine. One thing that we tend to do when it's just a little bit of ice is that we start turning the engine blade backwards. The fan blades are completely free to move, all right? So if we start turning them the opposite way, then if you do it quick enough, it will suck hot air from the core of the engine out, and that might actually melt off if it's just a tiny bit of ice. We have to check that manually afterwards. But otherwise we use those heaters, and a second way of doing it is call an engineer out who will take a bit of heated de-icing fluid, put it on a cloth of some sort, and just de-ice manually okay? Because obviously we cannot spray into the engines, okay? But fan blade de-icing can happen as we're taxiing out as well, and that's why you will notice if you're taking off and it is snowing outside or it's freezing conditions, sometimes the aircraft stops at the takeoff position. It revs up to 40%, which is a normal. If you've seen my engines about why we rev up the engines, you've seen the video about that, then you know why. But then we continue to spool the engine up to about 70%. We hold the aircraft on brakes, leave it at 70% for up to 30 seconds to make sure that it will remove, kind of shear off any ice that is built up on the fan blades during the taxi out. Once those 30 seconds are done, we release the brakes, hit the takeoff go-around button, the toga button, set takeoff thrust, and we go. So as you can see, there's loads and loads of procedures that are connected to de-icing. Stuff that you probably did not know, but you will think about it now. So just a little recap then. 5-step procedure needs to be done. Step 1 fluid, the type 1 fluid, tends to be orange in color. So if you see that, that's type 1. If you see a yellow color, light yellow color, it tends to be type 2 fluid, and if it's green, it's type 4 fluid. The type 4 fluid is a little bit more efficient, tends to have a little bit better hold over time, so it's phasing out type 2. Type 3 fluid you won't see on a commercial airliner, and the reason for that is because type 3 is made for smaller aircraft like Cessnas and aircraft that has lower speeds, because it shears off at the lower speed. Right? Great. If you have questions about that, as always, guys, make sure that you come in, you comment, you give a like to the video, you ask me questions, or you go into the Mentour Aviation app and you go into the chat, you tag @Mentour, and then you ask your question there. That's probably the most efficient way of reaching me on an everyday basis. I want to send a huge thank you to Brilliant.org, who's been sponsoring this episode and many others of my episode. I'm really proud to have them as part of the channel, because I know that they provide a premium service to make you better and increase your chances of being successful through your aviation training and through your selection process. Now, one course that I think you will really enjoy is a course in classical mechanics. You know, I've been talking about different momentums and why it's important to understand how momentum works in an aircraft because of the balance of the aircraft. Well, if you go in and you go through that course, you will understand much better what I'm talking about. So use this link here below. It will give you 20% off the annual fee of Brilliant. And go in, check out the daily problems they do every day and the specific courses that I'm talking about in my videos. And I promise you that once you've done that, you will understand and feel better about mathematics and physics in general. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are out there in the world, guys. Now go into the Mentour Aviation app. I am doing, within the next few months, there's going to be a huge upgrade to the app. It is going to be about 1,000% better. It's going to be a social hub for anyone who's interested in aviation. If you want to speak to an actual pilot in a positive and a constructive way, if you can ask any questions you want inside there, well then Mentour Aviation app is where you're supposed to go. So go in, check it out, and have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.